Welcome everyone to Mail Fuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about the Twilight Zone from the 1980s. This is season 1 episode 16. There's 3 stories in this episode. They are The Elevator, To See the Invisible Man, and Tooth and Consequences. So, spoilers for the episode. This is a Patreon sponsored review, so thank you to Cindy for picking the show. And this is another really strong episode, actually. The middle story in particular is very good. Now, that might sound almost a little strange, despite the fact that the last episode's middle story was very good. Typically, the short middle ones have been less, not the highlights of the shows. Last week was kind of the exception. But the format's a little bit different in this one, where the first and last story are not like super short. They're about maybe 10 minutes or so each. And then the middle story is actually the one that gets the most time. They put the longest one in the middle, which is a little bit different. In a weird way, it kind of works, at least in this case, because the middle one is the highlight of the episode. It's the best one. And the other ones, while not as good, are decent enough fun, for what they are. They kind of work as an appetizer and a dessert for the main course. But the main course is very much to see the Invisible Man. So I'll get to that in a minute. But the first story is The Elevator. This is Ray Bradbury was credited as the writer here for this one. So whether or not he actually just straight up did the script, he might have done, I don't know, or if they just based it on one of his shorts or whatever. But this is kind of a sort of cheesy B-movie creature story where 2 brothers who are not young, like, at least the older brother seems like he's like 20 or something, and the younger brother's a teenager. And they're looking for their father, who went missing. Not in the sense that he's been missing for a long time, but more in the sense that, hey, he was supposed to be back earlier. I bet he's off doing some of his crazy stuff. Let's go find him so he can come home for dinner. There's not that much tension in the search. They're more just kind of annoyed that they have to come and find him rather than being like, seriously missing where they're concerned. So it's these 2 characters, and they kind of come to this like abandoned like factory or warehouse or something like that. And there's just a lot of exposition between the 2 brothers about who their father is. And the main thing that comes up is that he's a scientist. The older brother kind of calls him a mad scientist. The younger brother defends him, but kind of can't deny that he has done a lot of crazy things with science experiments. And the little brother says that he knows his dad comes here maybe once every 6 months, maybe to check up on an experiment or something. But a lot of this story, at least up until they reveal kind of some of the stuff that's going on, is just them expositing dialogue and then kind of looking around this creepy old building with their torches, their flashlights, and theorizing what's going on and what their dad's up to. We never actually meet the dad. We assume he's dead at the end of the story based on what we see, but we don't actually get to see him. Because the main thing they find while they're there is like giant oversized rats. And they're like, wait, what the hell is this? What the hell did Dad do to make giant rats? And then they find a giant cat, like a house cat, but it's the size of like a tiger. And then we don't really get a good look at it, but the brother says that he sees a giant dog. Or maybe the image quality is just too poor, so the dark area of the screen, I just couldn't see it. But he said there was a giant dog there. I believe him based on everything else we saw. And they're like, wait, what's happening here? Did like the rats come first, then the cats ate the rat? But what killed the cat and the dog? Because they're all dead. Like, all these things are dead. They're all lying as corpses around this place, this laboratory that they've sort of stumbled into. And there's an elevator. And they basically reminisce that they remember coming here as boys and when they were kids and going up that elevator, and there's a little flashback, which, by the way, this little flashback has very, very bad visual effects. For whatever reason, because of the shot they wanted to do, they're kind of like, the elevator's kind of moving but surrounded by stuff that's just been superimposed in behind them, so it looks really dodgy. And that's even with like the bad image quality of these episodes, because they've never been like, lovingly remastered or anything like that, like the original Twilight Zone has. So even in this sort of blurry VHS looking quality that we have for these, this still stuck out is looking pretty rough. I can only imagine how bad that shot might have looked if it was in pristine HD. But yeah, basically the elevator, they try and get it working, it comes down, and the story ends with a giant ass spider inside the elevator grabbing them and taking them up the elevator. I think what's interesting about this story is that when I saw the title at the start, I immediately thought, oh, it's going to be about this elevator that goes somewhere cool. And I thought, oh, maybe it's an elevator that goes all the way into space. Maybe it's an elevator that goes up into a different dimension or something. You know, I was expecting the elevator to be really important because it was called the elevator. And instead, the elevator's not mentioned for 90% of the story. And then they see an elevator, have a weird flashback about going up and down the elevator as kids, and then there's a monster spider that grabs them and seemingly kills them. And the story ends with their flashlight like falling and hitting the floor, and that's it. Cut to black. We're done. So it's not a great story by any means. I think it's very like it's kind of fun. It's fun in a cheesy way where they're just kind of theorizing about what their crazy dad's up to. And you can never really take it too super seriously. It always feels like it's, yeah, this idea is a little bit silly, but let's just go with it and have some fun. And I do think the actor playing the younger brother, who I've definitely seen in a couple of movies, and I've seen him overact in a couple of movies from the 80s. He's just like that here. He's a bit over the top with his performance. But to be honest, like if you're wanting like a fun kind of pulpy, cheesy little story, I don't think it's bad. I think that if it was going to be any longer, it would need some more meat. There would have to be some sort of more payoff to who the dad is and what he's actually doing. Because there's never any real context given for anything. They just die at the end. And in some ways, maybe you could critique that and say they spend 10 minutes of almost the entire story having characters theorize about what's going on to just never really like give an answer. Like okay, there's a bigger monster that gets them, and we assume the dad did something to make these big monsters, but there's not really like anything else going on there really. So, but it's all right. It's kind of fun, and it's got a cool vibe if nothing else, and it's short and it's sweet, and it's painless. Like it goes down easy enough, right? It's like sometimes you get a 10-minute story that feel a lot longer. This didn't feel long. It didn't feel hard to get through. The setting and the general idea is fun enough that you can get into it. But I will say the title felt very misleading to me because it ended up being like, other than the fact that they happened to die in an elevator at the end, there's like nothing to do with an elevator for most of the story. And that doesn't make the elevator important. It just makes it happenstance that's where the story ends. But anyway, so yeah, not bad. Fun little cheesy time. The meat of the episode, though, is by far to see The Invisible Man, which is one of the best stories that this show has done up until this point. We've had a few great ones at this point now that were like 2/3 into the season. But this is such a cool idea that was interesting when it started, and I was kind of thinking about what it was actually doing, and then it kind of revealed and played its hand a little bit more. And then by the end, I actually thought the final kind of like story swerve or the ending, the evolution that it takes by the end felt like the most fitting thing that it could have done. And I found it to be like a really good little dystopian sci-fi story, but a dystopian sci-fi story that has a lot more kind of a heart by the end than say a Fahrenheit 451 or an Equilibrium or whatever. I mean, Equilibrium is just basically just based on Fahrenheit 451, but like these types of stories where society is a bit more controlled. So the setting or the premise for this story is that we're in the future at some time, right? And the main character is sentenced to a year of invisibility for being too cold to the people around him. Now that's obviously, that charge sounds a bit vague. I'll come back to that later. But he's sentenced to be invisible, and he kind of just smirks and goes, well, you think that's going to bother me? I hate people. Go on, make me invisible. I don't care. So they sort of put this device on his head, and it sort of like puts this sort of flesh kind of stamp on his forehead, right? It sort of sticks out a little bit. It's like a bit of flesh that's been stuck to him, but has kind of a vague shape to it. And as soon as they put this on, the people, the two sort of guards that were putting him in the chair, just start like, it's like they can't see him. They completely just start ignoring him. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting because we, the audience, can still see him. Because at this point, I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be a story about an invisible man. but it's not. It's not. But that's not a cheat. It's actually, I really like this premise when it gets into it, and I understood what it was doing. But so at first I thought, oh, he's going to be invisible. They've turned him invisible somehow, but we are always going to still see him because this story is going to be about how he feels when no one else can see him, but we can still see him because we're the audience. And I thought, okay, and to be fair, even thinking that, that's starting to touch on the themes that it's going to be playing with, even though that was wrong. Because it becomes clear as he starts like being in the street and running into people and things like that, that he is not invisible physically. Like, he's still visible. People can still see him. But this mark that he's got in his head is informing everyone else that they have to ignore him. That they have to act as if he is invisible, as if he is not there, and how lonely and how frustrating those interactions are going to start to feel. And the story actually takes place over the whole year. I mean, we don't see like every day, obviously, but we get day 1, we get day something, then it's day 100 or whatever, and eventually the final day we get like, you know, a sample of different times. And don't get me wrong, right? There is one little, you know, kink in the chain here, right? In terms of the premise, and that is the subject kind of is brought up that he has to be ignored no matter what, and he literally goes into places, right, where he's not invited, and they can't just throw him out because even the security can't acknowledge that he's there. So there is kind of like a, you know, an issue of like, well, surely at some point authorities would have to recognize he's there to stop him from hurting someone if he tried to, or stop him from doing something dangerous, that, you know, to other people. Like, there'd have to, like, you couldn't completely ignore them in society, right? So let's acknowledge that right up front. But I almost don't care. Because everything it does with this premise is so good. Because, you know, he goes to like a, you know, like a cafeteria, right? Maybe where he works. Not that he's working now, right? That's the thing. He doesn't have to work for a year. This is why. This is like a vacation from people and society. This is great. So he goes to the cafeteria and he goes up and says, "Hey, I'll have the roast." And the guy serving the food doesn't acknowledge him. And part of me, I was almost going to get annoyed at the story at this point, because I thought, wait, this is why did he expect this guy to give him anything? He can't be seen. Because at this point, I was still thinking he was invisible. It's not until the next interaction that the episode outright confirms that no one else, like, or that everyone can see him, right? So he just hops over the counter and starts serving himself, and everyone just ignores him. And this is where I was starting to think about, well, surely there's places he might try and go that they have to stop him. They can't just, you know, like, but I guess that's the point, is that, like, you really do ignore them even if they're doing something bad, even if they're doing something terrible, you still ignore them to make them feel truly invisible. And it's the moment after this where he goes to sit down, and he sits down in an empty sort of bench, but there's like a kid sitting across from him, and the kid says, "Hey, you can't sit there. You know, my mum's going to come back and sit there." He definitely said mum, but the woman next to him, though, like, turns to the kid and whispers and like points to her forehead to tell the kid, "Hey, no, you can't talk to him." And like the main character just kind of gets a little sad and decides to go and find another seat somewhere. So that's kind of the interaction that says, no, everyone can see him. No one's actually invisible here. This is a punishment this society in the future does, is that it gives you a branding where every single person is not allowed to talk to you. And we see that whenever he's outside on the street, there's these like spheric drones that are going around and basically monitoring if anyone like speaks to him or acknowledges him in any way. And presumably they will get into trouble if they do, right? It's very policed. So like, wonderful like concept, and then everything that it does after that and the story it tells about this character, because it's kind of like a series of different skits almost at first, where it's like, okay, we're going to skip ahead in time a little bit, we're going to see him, you know, at one point go to a fancy like diner, not diner, like a restaurant nightclub kind of thing, and he just walks in and talks to the concierge, who can't acknowledge him, but he's like, "Hey, you can't stop me from coming in here, so I'm just going to come in. I could never afford this place before, but I'm celebrating, so I'm just going to come in." And he has like a whole like Dark Night of the Soul moment where the stand-up comedian just walks around him and doesn't acknowledge him, and everyone else is laughing, and he's not a part of it. No one's letting him in to be a part of it. And there's a sequence as well where he's like down in his luck and he's getting drunk because of how bad this is making him feel, and he notices like a fancy spa and gym kind of place, and he goes in and he just saunters in and he makes a couple of comments to the woman at the desk who doesn't acknowledge him, and he just saunters in. He walks all the way. So this is the thing: whenever the subject of being an invisible man comes up, the subject always comes up, what pervy thing are they going to do, right? Like the idea of like the invisible man would sneak into the women's locker room and just watch because he can get away with it, right? That's something that always comes up with the premise. And I love that they went out of their way with this to still do it, even though he's not actually invisible. It's actually effing genius to do this moment where he's just depressed and he's thought of the thing that maybe this is the one thing I can do that I can get away with that'll make me feel better about being quote unquote invisible. But he stumbles into like the hot tub and like sort of bathhouse kind of room where there's a bunch of women in the big hot tub and there's women with towels on like around the sides of the room. And he comes in and he just stands next to the door, and the women in the hot tub, who are all just kind of chatting and smiling and having a nice chat or whatever, they notice him and they're about to kind of freak out, but like they see the mark in his head and they just kind of like all go silent and turn to each other, and they just kind of like sit there very quietly, maybe the odd whisper. And what's so beautiful about this moment is that he then gets really uncomfortable with how he's making them feel, because while they're ignoring that he's there in the sense that they're not looking at him and they're not yelling, hey, get out, you're not meant to be in here and things like that, they're kind of being forced to just sort of endure the fact that this man's standing there. And the way they're all kind of huddled together and whispering and kind of shivering a little bit, and they look scared, he recognizes that they look like he's making their life miserable, that he's actively like, this isn't fun, this isn't adventurous and sexy that he's in here and seeing possibly a bit of skin. He is just hit with this realization that he is just making these women feel terrible, and they're being forced to sit there and suffer because the rules of this society say that they can't respond to the fact that he's there. And it just makes them feel worse. I love this moment. That in some ways, this was the moment that I kind of like really fell in love with the story. Like I was getting into it and I was enjoying kind of what it was doing. I was seeing the themes that it was kind of exploring. But this moment was the bit where I was like, okay, this is actually maybe a genius idea. The idea that you do the invisible man in the women's locker room style moment, but he's not actually invisible, but all the women have to just bear it and pretend that he is. And just how uncomfortable that makes them feel, because he can see how uncomfortable they are, how scared they are. It, like, oh, chef's kiss. So, so they keep playing with the ideas a little bit, and there's you might have interacted with someone else here that I'll come back to, because the order of these events are a little bit hard to remember. But there's also a sequence where he's walking down the street and he sees two men breaking into a car. And they get kind of spooked because they're like, oh, someone's seen us. But then they notice his head and they're like, oh, he can't do anything. No one's going to listen to his police report or anything like that. So they just keep on breaking into the car. Main character feels kind of helpless and just walks away. But then when they get into the car, they decide to chase him down and they actually run him over with a car. And I'm like, yeah, wait a minute. Like, he's technically invisible. Could he even go to a hospital right now? He's been hurt. Someone's just committed a crime against him, and he can't ask for help. He can't go and get aid. Like, the idea that he's that invisible and that he's going to be just completely ignored by society. It's one thing when it's just people won't talk to you when you're out, doing some shopping or whatever. It's another thing when you need people to survive. And he even like calls, he does like a Skype call with his future tech from the 80s version of the video call, and he's talking to the woman on the phone saying, hey, I really need, like, I've been hurt, I'm injured, I need to go to the hospital. And the whole time he's kind of like ducking his head down like this with his hand over his forehead so that she can't see that he's an invisible. And she says, hey, that's good. If you just let me scan your face to get the system will recognize you. We can set up the ambulance or whatever. and he doesn't want to, and she says, no, I have to, the face scan's the only way we can do this. And as soon as he lifts up his head, which he does slowly, knowing what's going to happen, he gives up, he lifts up his head, and the woman just looks angry, and the call ends. No help for you. He's been completely abandoned by society. And it's just such an interesting like thought experiment to like really sort of go through this to its logical end. And you know, so we kind of skipped towards the end at that point. And there's one thing that I've left out intentionally because I'm going to go back and sort of bring it in to like tie the story together. But when it gets to day 365, it's been a full year. These two men, the same two men that put him in the chair in the first place, arrive at his apartment. They put down a chair, and they kind of just wait for him to sit there, and then they take off the thing. And he's drunk at this point. He's not drunk, but he's like kind of like delirious, and he's like, oh, like it's finally over. I finally get to be free of this. And there's a moment where after they take the thing off his head, right, and he's like, oh, there's not even a scar, and he's smiling, he's happy. The two guys say, hey, why don't we celebrate with you and take you out for a drink? And the main character does not do anything negative here. He smiles and he's nice about it, but he says, oh, I don't think so. I think I just wanted, he doesn't even finish his sentence, but it's like, oh, he's got plans for what he wants to do now that he's free, now that people can see him and talk to him. And the interesting little bit here is that one of the guys kind of gets a little bit like, makes a stern face and says, it's tradition. Almost like this is not optional, like you will have a good time and socialize with us. And it kind of started to really paint a light of just how cruel this society is, where when we see him with a coworker after this and she's telling him that, hey, you've been such a nice man since you came back. We know where you were for a year, but we think it's done you good because you're much nicer to everyone. It's great. You're better. And it kind of felt like, this is taking a bit of a sinister undertone. While he might have been a dick at the start of the story, like what society is like doing to people if they don't fit everyone else's version of what they consider to be nice and like social. Because this is the thing, to go back to that vague like crime that he had committed. You're too cold with everyone. That was what they said at the start of the episode. Not you assaulted someone, not that you like ran someone over with a car or murdered someone. You're too cold to everyone, so you have to do this for a year. You have to be ignored by the entirety of society for 1 year. I like, it's like, hey, that's actually pretty cruel. And this idea that there's always this threat lingering that if you mess up, you'll have to do it again. That it's sort of like it doesn't at face value feel as cruel as 1984 or Fahrenheit 451, but once you actually stop and think about it, there is kind of a really sinister undertone to it. In fact, one of the scenes that I glossed over, one of the bits that I missed when I was talking about it, that I had just forgotten about, honestly, is that there's a scene where a blind man is in the cafeteria with him, and the blind man comes up and says, hey, can I take that seat? And of course, because the blind man can't actually see him, he doesn't know that he's not supposed to be talking to him. And it really excites the main character to talk to someone. And he's like, hey, would you like some of my soup? And the old man's saying he's very kind. They're being very friendly. And it's a very wholesome little moment. And then one of the women who work at the cafeteria notice what's happening. And she just walks up to the old blind man, whispers in his ear. And the blind man says, oh, shame on you, and gets up and leaves. Like, he almost like got around it a little bit, that this blind man was going to give him a little bit of company just for 15 minutes of lunch, whatever it might have been. Wasn't allowed that either. So yeah, just the idea of the cruelty of it. Not just so much the cruelty of like ignoring someone, but the idea of like why it's being done. And it's like you have to conform to our idea of what you should be. We get to decide that you have to be this happy all the time, this bubbly all the time, and you have to adhere to it, or you will get punished for not being the right kind of person. That's the sinister part of it for me, really. But so the thing I've missed out, because this is what rolls back around to the ending. There's a couple of bits in the middle of the story where he's like out in the street, and there's like one actually quick little moment where he awkwardly bumps into another invisible. There's another man with like the thing in his head. and they kind of stare at each other for a minute, like, wait, can we talk to each other? Like, can we do that? And I think the drone like comes out and like go do, and is looking at them, and they both kind of like tense up and just walk away. But it's like a little moment of like making you think about, oh yeah, there's other people that have got this punishment. What happens there? So later on in the story, when he's at his worst, when he's really feeling depressed, I think it's after he's been at the nightclub with the comedian, and he's just down in his luck. He feels really sad. He's really starting to like get properly psychologically like affected by it. He runs into a woman who has the invisible mark, and he's really like sad. He's really upset, and he goes up to her and he basically starts begging her to talk to him. He's like, hey, you know what this is like, you know how this feels, please just talk to me, acknowledge that I am here. And he wants her to say something to him, and she doesn't, right? She kind of like tries to avoid him, and she just leaves and goes on. And it's apparent because of the ending that she is much earlier in her sentence here, right? She's probably just had this done recently. She's still obeying the rules, and like she hasn't broken down yet like he has, is what I'm getting at. Because at the end of the episode, after he's had his little scene with the co-worker, he's walking down the street and he runs again into this woman who's invisible. And she has now reached that tipping point. She has now reached that point where she is desperate for acknowledgement, she's desperate for communication, and she sees him, remembering that he begged her for this once, and she goes up and starts like saying, please look at me, please acknowledge me, tell me you see me, talk to me. And he, he looks up, he sees a drone, and he tries to keep walking ahead, and he's trying to he's struggling. It's kind of hurting him that he's not able to like give her some comfort. And at this point in the story, right, and I've kind of fallen in love with the story by this point because I think it's done some really smart things. But ultimately, what makes it a great story is this ending. Because I was thinking at this moment here, you know what? Despite the story starting under the guise that, oh, this is a story about an asshole who's going to learn the error of his ways. But I don't think that's what the story is, right? The story isn't that. The story is about this society and about fitting in, even if technically you not fitting in is because you're a bit of a dick, right? Right? And maybe that's not the way to put it. Because what's beautiful about this ending, and I kind of saw it coming, and I was actually on the edge of my seat hoping for the ending that ultimately we got. Because as he's walking away from this woman, and as he's ignoring her, he's following the rules, and she's begging, and she's almost breaking down in tears. What I was hoping here is that he is going to break the rules. I'm hoping that he is going to say screw it and turn around and talk to her. And that's effectively what happens. She one of the last things she says before he does so is that she just wants a hug or something like that. And he turns around, he walks up and he hugs her, and he says, you're important, you're real, you matter, I see you. And it's this really touching moment that is so uplifting. And the drones come in and start going, bleep, stop doing this, you're going to be sentenced to another year of silence or another year of invisibility. And he doesn't look up at it, he doesn't care, he just smiles at the woman and gives her this comfort that she has seen. And when the narrator comes in and says, hey, he's going to have another year of this, but this time he's not going to be that depressed about it, because this time he's going to wear that mark in his head like a badge of honor, because he did this for a good reason. But I love the idea that they did this treatment or this punishment to him, because at face value, it's supposed to make him better for everyone else. It's supposed to make him a better person and appreciate people. And it's exactly what it did. It did make him appreciate people. It made him appreciate people in such a way that he can't do that to someone else. He can't treat this woman like he was being treated. It truly gave him empathy and sympathy, and it actually worked. But that reveals the actual intention of the punishment, which is to be a punishment, to scare people into acting like how the powers that be, the government, whoever's controlling society, the general consensus, whatever it is, like, you have to act like everyone else does, and we're going to force you into it. We're going to scare you into it because you've got this stick behind you if you don't. But instead, it actually taught him how to feel and care about people. And this ending is him saying, screw all their stupid rules. I'm going to care about this person and acknowledge them because what they're doing to her is cruel. I love that ending. And it's the sort of thing where it started to like occur to me that that's what the ending might be as this woman was coming up, and I was hoping that it would be, because it could have ended on like a little sort of somber note where he just doesn't, like, he sort of bites his tongue and he walks off, and then the narration comes in and says something about I don't know, like I don't know, but like I could have seen that ending, but this ending was perfect. This is exactly how it should have ended. There's layers to this that I really love. The idea of just the idea that everything here is fake, right? Like all of the ways that we judge each other. Well, I mean, not all the ways. There's obviously things that are absolutely right and wrong, but right, you don't kill someone, right? That's obviously bad. But that a lot of the expectations for how we should talk and act and things like that, they're all made up. They're all just stuff that's developed over time. They're all just like a construct that we have made as a society, right? To use a term. And that's not what's really important, right? Obviously, we kind of like encourage certain behaviors and things because they represent, or they build up what the important parts are. The important parts of the empathy behind it. It's the caring about the other person that's important, not about faking it because it's what you're expected to sound and act like, right? It's about actually showing some humanity and so on. And this idea of like everyone in this future having to just pretend that someone is invisible, even when they're somewhere where they're not supposed to be, even where it's super awkward, because society said you have to shun someone, only for that to like actually create a better person by the end of the story, who then breaks the rules again anyway because he cares too much about the people that this is affecting, that this is the other people who are having this done to them. It's like, no, your individuality, whoever you were, matters. It doesn't, just because you don't fit into what the rest of the world says that you're supposed to, doesn't mean that you don't count. So, despite the fact that it's this dystopian idea and it's kind of trying to control people and force them to be a certain way, the ending is very uplifting. And honestly, as far as like a story goes, with like an arc, with a traditional character arc where there's a meaning behind it, a moral by the end where someone improves and becomes better, I don't know if I can think of another story in this Twilight Zone that's had as good of a core traditional narrative, like a traditional character arc than this. But it's filled with the layers of science fiction and the subtext, all that stuff. And I forgot to mention as well, at one point he tries to wear a hat to hide his mark, and it just like burns through the hat, like it knows that it's been hidden. It's like, no, sir, you will not hide your mark. So it's so good. And you know, obviously, I think there's probably some other things that this is alluding to that I've not even mentioned. You know, when you think of someone being marked so that everyone in public knows who they are and that they should be treated a certain way, it's hard not to think of Jewish people during Nazi Germany and that kind of thing. I assume that there's some intentional ideas that are kind of, you know, being lifted there. I think all of this stuff feels so rich in its ideas, and I you know, sometimes you get like a cool little idea, right, that just kind of feels half-assed, right? Kind of like the first story in this, even though it was fun for what it was tone-wise. And then you get a story like this where this feels like this is the sort of story that Twilight Zone was made for, was something that actually feels like it's given as a genuinely new science fiction idea. Like, even though I'm comparing this to some other classic science fiction works in some ways, right? It's the actual implementation, the actual premise of what's happening in this world, of everyone just pretending someone's invisible, actually does genuinely feel new to me. I don't think I can think of something else that is this type of premise, even though I can see thematically and, like, you know, how maybe you can mash some things together to kind of get there. It feels unique to me. And this is one of the stories from this season where I'm like, you know what, I'm really glad that I saw this. I'm glad that I you know, it had me thinking. It had me the entire time. Like once he started having more interactions with people and he was going to different places, it had me thinking about what this says about the people who are still choosing to ignore him, what it says about him and how he's feeling in the moment, what it says about the society that's implementing this and forcing people to do this, and how arguably it's kind of cruel to even the people who are ignoring him, who might want to say something and help when they see him look scared or sad or depressed because he's alone. But yeah, just wonderful stuff. I kind of like. I can't say I loved it from start to finish because, like I said, like it definitely clicked into place as it went, and there was a sort of moment in the middle where I'm like, oh, I think this may be amazing actually. But it took time building there. It sort of earned it over the time, and it got me to really appreciate it by the end. So yeah, very satisfying. When I do my top 5 or maybe top 10 stories at the end of the season, depending on whatever number I feel is appropriate, I think this will definitely be in the running to be on that list. So that is To See the Invisible Man. Highly recommend it. Even if you're not going to watch the other stories in the episode, I would recommend checking that one out. It's on YouTube. You can go watch it. Really, it's wonderful science fiction. I highly recommend it. How do you follow that? Well, you're not going to beat it, but maybe you can just give us something a little bit silly, and hopefully it's entertaining. And that is what Tooth and Consequences is, which is a story about a dentist who is depressed and hyperventilating with a psychiatrist because he hates being a dentist. He hates that people squirm whenever he touches them, or they're scared to come to the dentist. He's scared that women don't want to be with him because he's a dentist. And he goes to his dental practice, and his assistant quits because he's making her life miserable by being so like over the top depressed. He tells his patients to go away, and then ultimately he's upset because the attractive woman who came in for a visit turns down his date. And it's a funny enough scene. Like, it's definitely played for comedy. It's played for this guy's overacting. He's when she turns down a dinner date, he says, "Oh, let me guess, it's because of this, it's because of that." And he says, "Oh, it's because after dating, like a rocket scientist and a pilot, a dentist is a bad move." And she just deadpan goes, "Oh, you understand," which was a funny line, to be honest. That she didn't try and sugarcoat it. She's like, "Yeah, you're right." It was funny though because he says at one point, "Oh, women basically don't think I'm a real doctor because I'm a dentist," and I'm like, this must be like an old joke or trope, because I don't feel like I've ever heard anyone talk about a dentist as if, oh, they're not a real doctor because they're a dentist. I don't think that is a thing anymore. I assume it was at one point, and that's why they're making that joke. But I do not think anyone has that opinion of dentists anymore. Mainly because they're in there messing around with your teeth. You have to be nice to the dentist. You have to make them feel respected so that they won't, torture you. So yeah, it's kind of a silly story that ultimately leads to a man showing up who's actually the Tooth Fairy. He's wearing a black suit and has a red shirt on underneath, which honestly, the red shirt made me think it was more of a Cupid kind of look. In fact, maybe it made me think of that because we literally had an episode or a story of this show several episodes ago about a Cupid showing up and trying to make two people fall in love, which is kind of ultimately what this story falls into, is the mythological quirky character shows up and does something to the person's life. Often it's the devil. I've talked about how there's already been multiple stories with the devil, but we've also had Cupid. Now we've got the Tooth Fairy. Maybe you can have, I feel like they all kind of, there's more devil ones than any other type, but they all kind of fall under an umbrella of mythical character shows up and makes something happen, and either the character learns a lesson, gets what they want, or in this case, it just makes their life worse, and it's kind of a monkey's paw kind of thing. Because he asks for everyone to respect him and for the woman to fall in love with him. And then the joke kind of ending to it is that he's basically just too tired and exhausted because everyone thinks he's the best dentist ever, and that he's got too many patients, and he finds that torture now. So he ultimately skedaddles and ends up on a train heading somewhere to with a bunch of other people. It's kind of like one of those old timey things where there's a bunch of people like sort of just jumping in the train car, and they're just sitting there. And it turns out that everyone that he's sitting with was also a dentist, who are also on the run from society because being a dentist was too much torture in in the world because everyone hates them. And that's pretty much the end of the story. It's kind of funny. It's amusing. I think the performances are what really make it work because he's over the top. He's sort of falling over his dentist chair because he's depressed. Not in like a slapstick way. Kind of like just sort of like slouches over it and lies upside down at one point. So it's not like a Mr. Bean fall or anything like that. It's more just like I just don't care how I sit anymore. I'm just going to lie here as if I'm dead. He actually tries to kill himself before the Tooth Fairy shows up. That's why the Tooth Fairy shows up, is because that is like, oh no, there's a dentist. Every time a dentist tries to off themselves, the Tooth Fairy must come in and try and stop them. Which I guess also makes it very It's a Wonderful Life, but with a dentist. But instead of helping him, he just plays a sick monkey's paw style joke on him. So it's amusing. Like, I think the first story and the last story in this episode are perfectly fine. They're perfectly entertaining, but they're not that deep. They're kind of like one note, and that's it, right? But that middle story, To See the Invisible Man, which is the perfect title now that I've actually watched the story, is wonderful science fiction. It's one of the must-sees of this season so far. I highly recommend it. It is worth going out your way to watch it. If you're only cherry-picking the stories you watch based on my reviews, if my word means that much to you, then watch To See the Invisible Man. It's a great story. And yeah, so there you go. That's my thoughts on this Twilight Zone. And because I've been running a little bit late this week, you'll be getting another episode of 80s Twilight Zone before the week is out, because I have to fit another one in before the end of the month. So thank you very much for joining. I do appreciate it. Keep watching the channel, like, subscribe, all that stuff. And of course, you can support everything over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and help keep the content coming, get bonuses, but especially the movie podcast stuff has a lot of bonus content. Go check out Mailfuzz Movies, the YouTube channel, if you've not seen our movie podcasts. There's a sci-fi one, which is maybe the most relevant to your interest, but there's also a horror one and sort of a franchise one, and lots of fun stuff over there. So check out the Patreon and all that stuff. But that is me, so thank you very much for joining. I do appreciate it. Keep watching TV in the Twilight Zone.